She had no name, no ID, no past. She paid in cash, smiled at the front desk, and walked into one of Oslo's most prestigious hotels like she belonged there. 2 days later, she was dead, and someone had made absolutely certain that no one would ever find out who she was. Her fingerprints had been deliberately, methodically removed, not by accident, not by the elements, by human hands, with intention. Whoever killed this woman didn't just want her dead, they wanted her erased. This is the story of the Isdal woman. Oslo, Norway, 1995. A city of order, a city of precision, a country that had built its modern identity on the quiet confidence of a society that works, a government that functions, a citizenry that trusts its institutions. Norway in the mid-90s was a nation at peace with itself in a way that very few countries on Earth could claim. The Cold War had ended. The oil money was flowing. Oslo's streets were clean, its crime rates among the lowest in the developed world. It was, by almost any measure, one of the safest places on Earth to live. And yet, there are things that happen even in the safest corners of the world that resist explanation. Cases that slip through the fingers of even the most meticulous investigators. Mysteries that outlast the careers of the detectives who worked them, that haunt the officers who couldn't close them, that follow families across decades without mercy. This is one of those cases. The Grand Hotel Oslo sits on Karl Johans Gate, the city's main boulevard, in the very heart of the Norwegian capital. It is not merely a hotel. It is an institution, a landmark, a place where Nobel Peace Prize laureates stay the night before their ceremony, where Henrik Ibsen once sat at the same table every single day, where the windows look out onto the Royal Palace and the Parliament building with equal indifference. To check in here is to announce something about yourself, to say, I matter, I have resources, I move through the world at a certain level. In the late autumn of 1995, a woman checked into the Grand Hotel. She was well-dressed, composed. Her manner was confident, her appearance striking. The staff would later describe her as somewhere between 30 and 40 years old, with dark hair, a slim build, and an accent that was difficult to place. Not Norwegian, not quite German, not quite French. She gave a name at the front desk. It was false. She provided no identification. At the Grand Hotel Oslo in 1995, this was somehow accepted. Cash was exchanged. A key was handed over, and the woman walked upstairs. No one would speak to her again. The date was the 20th of November, 1995. For 2 days, the woman moved through the hotel like a ghost. She was seen in the corridors. Once near the elevator, staff noticed she kept odd hours. She ordered nothing from room service. She made no phone calls from the room line, or if she did, the records would later prove elusive. On the 22nd of November, housekeeping knocked. No answer. They knocked again. Nothing. The door was opened. The woman was found dead inside her room. The scene was not one of obvious violence. There was no blood sprayed across the walls, no immediate signs of struggle. To the untrained eye, in those first terrible moments, it might almost have looked like a natural death, a woman lying still. But then the investigators arrived, and they began to look closer. Her fingerprints were gone, not worn, not faded with age, gone, deliberately removed. The skin at each fingertip showed clear evidence of intentional abrasion, or chemical treatment, or both. The exact method would be debated, but the conclusion was not. Someone had systematically destroyed the one identifier that would have been most useful in establishing who this woman was. This was not something her killer had done in a moment of panic. This took time. This took planning. This took knowledge. The Oslo police were called, then the Criminal Investigation Unit. Then, quietly, without announcement, other agencies began to circle the case. The lead detective assigned to the investigation was a careful, experienced officer who had worked homicides for years in the Norwegian capital. His name was Erik Tandberg. He had seen difficult cases before. He had worked deaths that resisted easy answers. He had never seen anything like this. The first task was the most basic. Who was this woman? It sounds simple. It is, in most cases, answered within hours. A wallet, a passport, a hotel registration with a real name, a family member who calls to report someone missing. None of that happened here. The name she had given at check-in was false. The cash she had paid with was untraceable. No one came forward to report a missing woman matching her description. No embassy made inquiries. No family materialized. Tandberg and his team worked outward from the hotel, interviewing every member of staff who had interacted with her, canvassing the surrounding streets, checking CCTV footage from the era's limited camera networks. They found almost nothing. What they did find was this. The woman had been seen, before checking into the Grand Hotel, at several other locations in Oslo. Witnesses placed her at a cafe near the central station, at a newsstand on Stortingsgata. There were suggestions, never confirmed, that she had been in the city for several days before she checked in, moving carefully, staying out of photographs, paying always in cash. The forensic examination of the body was extensive. Cause of death was eventually determined, though the investigators were careful about what they released to the public. There were signs consistent with poisoning. The specific substance was difficult to isolate with the technology available at the time. What was clear was that this woman had not died naturally and had not died by her own hand. Someone had killed her. Someone had killed her and taken the time to remove her fingerprints, and then had walked out of the Grand Hotel Oslo without being seen by a single camera, remembered by a single witness, or leaving a single trace of evidence behind. Among her belongings in the room, which were few and deliberately so, investigators found some clothing. Some toiletry items purchased, it appeared, from various European cities. There were labels removed from garments, cut out carefully and cleanly. No receipts, no written notes, no diary, no address book, no mobile phone, which was admittedly less unusual in 1995 than it would become. But there was something, a small fragment, a partial label on one of her items that contained lettering consistent with Central European manufacture. It was not much. It was almost nothing. And yet it was the first suggestion, the first whisper, that this woman had not simply arrived in Oslo from nowhere. She had come from somewhere. She had a life. She had a past. She had been hidden from both. The investigation spread outward. Interpol was contacted. European agencies were quietly looped in. Photographs of the woman, reconstructed and carefully composed from what the investigators had, were circulated. No one recognized her. The mystery deepened. It was when investigators began piecing together the timeline of her movements, cross-referencing them with hotel records from other Norwegian cities and eventually other European countries, that something extraordinary began to emerge. This was not her first time. Records, painstakingly assembled over months of detective work, suggested that the woman had checked into hotels across at least 6 European countries in the years prior to her death, always under different names, always paying in cash, always without identification. The aliases varied. The handwriting on registration forms, when samples could be obtained and compared, sometimes matched, sometimes didn't. She had been moving across Europe for years, living in hotels, living under false names, collecting identities the way other people collect keys, and discarding them just as easily. She spoke, according to various witnesses across various countries, at least 4 languages, possibly more. Her accent shifted depending on context. In one account, she was Flemish. In another, she was German. In another, a Southern European national whose precise origin could not be pinned down. This woman was not a tourist who had fallen into trouble. She was a professional, someone trained or experienced in the art of invisibility, and someone, ultimately, had found her anyway. Now we must pause, because in cases like this one, we risk something important. We risk reducing a human being to a puzzle, to a set of unanswered questions, to a cold detail in an investigator's notebook. And this woman was not a puzzle. She was a person. She was somewhere between 30 and 40 years old, which means she had a childhood. Somewhere in Europe, possibly Central Europe, possibly Eastern Europe, there was a town or a city or a village where a girl was born who would one day become this woman. There were parents, perhaps siblings, a school she attended, a first language she spoke before she learned the others. At some point, her life took a turn that led her here, to a hotel room in Oslo in November, alone. Whatever she was involved in, whatever world she inhabited, she did not deserve to die the way she died. She did not deserve to have her very identity stripped from her, first in life, by whoever sent her across Europe under false names, and then in death, by whoever removed her fingerprints and left her for housekeeping to find. The investigators who worked this case were not indifferent to this weight. Tandberg himself would speak in later years about how the case stayed with him, about how the absence of a name made it harder, not easier, to set aside. There was no file to close, no family to notify, no grave marker with the right inscription. Just an open question that accumulated dust in a cabinet while the years passed. In Norway, there are social welfare offices, there are community organizations, there are systems designed to ensure that people do not fall through the cracks. The country takes pride in this. And yet, here was a woman who had fallen through every crack imaginable, and the system had no mechanism to catch someone who had apparently spent years making herself impossible to catch. Interpol continued to hold her case open. So did the Norwegian authorities. But the years stretched on: 1996, 1997, 2000, 2005. No identification. No family came forward. No intelligence agency publicly acknowledged knowing who she was. If somewhere in Europe a mother wondered what had happened to her daughter, she did not find her way to Oslo's police records. If a brother searched, he did not find her. If a friend mourned in private, they mourned in silence. The woman remained nameless. Remains nameless. She was given a designation by investigators. Not a name. A designation. The way you label an unknown sample in a laboratory. She is buried in Norway. The grave exists. The grave is marked. But the name on it is not her name, because no one knows her name. There is something almost unbearable about that. A woman. A life. An entire human history. And at the end of it, a grave with the wrong name. Or no name at all. Now, let us consider what we think we know. There are 3 primary theories that serious investigators, journalists, and intelligence analysts have advanced over the years to explain who this woman was and what happened to her. Each has evidence in its favor. None is conclusive. The first theory is that she was an intelligence operative, a spy. This is the theory that has gained the most traction in the serious analytical community, and it is not difficult to see why. The behavioral profile is consistent in almost every detail. The multiple aliases, the cache-only existence, the linguistic versatility, the deliberate erasure of identifying markers, including the fingerprints, which speaks to tradecraft, to a world where being identified means being dead. The mid-1990s were, contrary to popular assumption, not a quiet period for European intelligence activity. The Cold War had ended formally, but its structures hadn't dissolved overnight. Former Soviet bloc intelligence services were fragmenting, with operatives suddenly without handlers, without paychecks, without institutional loyalty. Western agencies were scrambling to recruit from the wreckage. Private intelligence operations were proliferating in the vacuum. And Norway, with its NATO membership, its geographic proximity to Russia, its major ports, and its oil infrastructure, was not the sleepy geopolitical backwater it appeared. If this woman was an operative, she was either killed by a rival service that had finally tracked her down despite her precautions, or she was eliminated by her own organization when she became a liability. Both possibilities are consistent with the evidence. Both are consistent with the silence that followed. Intelligence organizations do not call press conferences to acknowledge their losses. The deliberate removal of her fingerprints supports this theory most powerfully. It is not the act of a civilian killer. It suggests someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who understood that fingerprints were the primary identification tool of 1995 law enforcement, and who wanted to buy time, perhaps enough time for other loose ends to be tied up elsewhere. The second theory is that she was a victim of organized crime. Europe in the mid-90s was experiencing a dramatic expansion of transnational organized criminal networks, particularly in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse. Eastern European criminal organizations were establishing footholds in Western European cities. Trafficking networks, arms smuggling, financial fraud operations, narcotics distribution channels. These organizations operated across borders with a sophistication that frequently outpaced law enforcement's ability to track them. Under this theory, the woman was either a participant in such a network, perhaps a courier, a money mover, a logistics coordinator, or she was a witness or informant whose usefulness had ended. Her cross-border movement pattern would fit either role. The false identities would be provided to her by the organization she served, and her death would be the organization's way of ensuring she never talked to the wrong person. The fingerprint removal, under this theory, is both a practical measure to delay identification and a message, a demonstration of what happens to those who become problems. The removal of all identifying information from her clothing supports this theory as well. This is not something a frightened individual typically does to themselves. This is something an organization does to its assets, either to protect itself or to protect the asset, or both. The third theory is simultaneously simpler and more disturbing in its own way. Some investigators have suggested that the woman was running, not working. Running. That she was fleeing from something, from someone, from some situation in her past life, and that she had deliberately constructed her invisible existence as a means of survival. Under this theory, she is not an operative. She is not an asset. She is a woman who learned, out of necessity, how to disappear. How to move through the world without leaving traces, because leaving traces had become dangerous for her. This theory would explain the amateurish quality of some of her cover stories, which did not always hold up to close scrutiny. It might explain the variability in her aliases and documentation, which a well-resourced intelligence agency would have made more consistent. It might explain why she was in Oslo at all, a city far from where the threat, whatever it was, originated. But it does not explain the fingerprints. The removal of fingerprints is a sophisticated act. It requires knowledge, equipment, and time. A woman running alone, in fear, in a hotel room, does not do this to herself as a precaution. It is done to her. Or it is done after her death. And that brings us back, inescapably, to the same conclusion. Someone found her. Someone who was looking. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And that someone has never been found, charged, or identified. The case of the woman found dead in Oslo's Grand Hotel in November 1995 remains officially open. It has never been solved. Despite advances in DNA analysis, despite the expansion of international forensic databases, despite renewed interest in the case from investigative journalists and independent researchers who have spent years attempting to trace her movements and her origins, she remains unidentified. She is, in the truest sense of the word, a ghost. And there is something in that which should unsettle us, not just as true crime viewers, as people. We live in an age of surveillance, of data trails, of digital footprints so dense and so persistent that the concept of genuine anonymity has become almost theoretical. And yet this woman, in 1995, achieved something that in some ways seems more impossible now than it would have then. She moved through one of the most orderly, well-documented societies in the world, and left almost nothing. She was erased before she was killed, in a sense. Her identity had already been stripped by whatever life she led. Her fingerprints were the last physical link to a self that had apparently ceased to exist long before November 1995. Whoever she was, whatever she did, whatever choices she made or was forced to make, she deserved to be known. She deserved to have her name on her grave. She deserved to have someone, somewhere, grieve her properly, openly, with her real face and her real history. She did not get that. She remains, nearly 3 decades after her death, the woman with no name in the hotel room in Oslo. And somewhere out there, perhaps, is someone who knows exactly who she was. They have said nothing. They may never say anything. The file stays open. The grave stays marked with the wrong name. And Oslo's Grand Hotel, on Karl Johans Gate, continues to welcome its guests with the quiet elegance of an institution that has witnessed a great deal of history and disclosed very little of it. Next week, Cold Files Global travels to Southeast Asia, a city in the middle of an economic boom, a death that the authorities closed in 72 hours, and the family that spent 20 years proving they were wrong. You will not want to miss it. If this case stayed with you the way it has stayed with the investigators who worked it, subscribe. We cover the cases that time forgot, the files that were closed too soon, the people who deserve to be remembered. Subscribe, and remember the woman in room number we will never know, in Oslo, in November, in 1995. She had no name, but she was real.